This line will destroy your company. The words didn't belong in a room like this, not from someone like her, and yet they landed harder than the weight of the $200 million contract sitting on the polished glass table. Richard Hale's pen froze midair, just an inch above the signature line, the faint scratching sound cutting off like someone had pulled the plug on the entire room. For a second, no one moved. The skyline outside, 30 floors of steel and sunlight, reflected across the table in sharp, cold lines, slicing through the silence. Then came the shift. Heads turned, slowly, one by one, toward the back of the room, toward her. Maya Williams stood near the side wall, a gray cleaning cloth still folded in her hand, her uniform plain, almost invisible against the marble and glass. She wasn't supposed to be seen here. She wasn't supposed to speak. A few of the executives exchanged glances, confusion turning quickly into something sharper, something dismissive. One man leaned back in his leather chair, lips curling just enough. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low but cutting. "Did the cleaning staff just interrupt a board meeting?" A quiet chuckle followed, thin and controlled, but it spread quickly, rippling across the table like a signal. Maya didn't laugh. She didn't flinch either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the document in Richard's hand, not on the people staring at her, not on the quiet ridicule pressing in from every direction. "Page 14, she said, her voice calm, steady in a way that didn't match her position in the room. Second paragraph. The wording looks standard, but it shifts the entire liability structure. Another pause. This one heavier. Richard's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. He hadn't signed yet. Not yet. Across from him, his chief legal officer frowned, already flipping pages, the thin paper whispering under his touch. "That's not possible," the man muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but the confidence in his tone had already begun to crack. Maya took one small step forward, just enough for the overhead light to catch her face, revealing the quiet certainty in her expression. "It's written to sound protective," she continued, "but if anything goes wrong after the merger, lawsuits, compliance issues, financial loss, your company absorbs all of it." The room tightened. You could feel it, like the air had shifted pressure. A few executives leaned in. Now, not laughing anymore, eyes scanning the same lines Maya had seen. The legal officer stopped flipping. His finger hovered over a sentence, then traced it again, slower this time. Richard watched him. Not Maya, not yet. The man swallowed. Subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. "Richard," he said quietly, his voice no longer steady. "We need to review this clause again." Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried weight. Consequence. Richard finally lowered the pen, placing it carefully on the table. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Then, for the first time, he looked at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. Maya didn't look away. She simply stood there, a maid in a room built for power, holding nothing but a cleaning cloth and a truth no one else had seen. And in that moment, the deal that was supposed to secure everything began to unravel. The sound of the pen settling on glass still lingered as no one spoke. Not immediately, not after that quiet confirmation that something was wrong. Because in rooms like this, power did not react quickly, it recalculated. And Richard Hale leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing just enough to signal that the moment had shifted from interruption to evaluation. While across the table the legal officer adjusted his glasses and read the same sentence again, slower this time, his lips pressing into a thin line as if the words themselves had changed under his gaze. "It is structured as a conditional safeguard," he began, choosing each word carefully. "But the trigger conditions are broad, unusually broad," and a second executive leaned in, tapping the page with the back of his pen. "Define broad," he said. But his tone had lost its earlier confidence, and the lawyer exhaled quietly. "Broad enough that almost any post-merger dispute could activate it." And the air in the room seemed to tighten another degree, like pressure building behind invisible walls, because that was not a minor oversight. That was exposure. And exposure at this scale was measured in numbers that could erase companies, reputations, entire careers, and Richard's gaze shifted again, this time not to the document, but back to Maya, who still stood near the edge of the room, still holding that same folded cloth. Her posture straight, but not defensive. calm in a way that did not match the tension surrounding her, as if she had already stepped through the storm that was only now beginning for everyone else. "How did you see it?" Richard asked, his voice even, controlled, but no longer dismissive, and a few heads turned again, surprised not by the question but by the fact that it had been asked at all, because moments ago she had been invisible, and now the most powerful man in the room was waiting for her answer. Maya did not rush. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply glanced at the contract again, then back at him. "I read it," she said, and someone near the far and let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like disbelief. But she continued before the reaction could grow. "The phrasing is familiar, but the sequence is not. The protection clause appears before the limitation clause, which means the protection overrides the limit. And that was when it happened, subtle but unmistakable." The second lawyer reached for the document and flipped back 2 pages, scanning quickly, then slower, then stopping entirely as his finger pressed down on a line he had clearly missed before. "She is right," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just plainly. But that was enough, because truth did not need volume in a room built on precision, and the shift that followed was immediate, not chaos, not panic, but a controlled unraveling. Questions began forming behind eyes, calculations rewriting themselves in real time. And across the table the representative from the opposing firm straightened slightly, his expression tightening in a way that had not been there before, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. "This is standard language," he said, his tone smooth but just a fraction too quick, and Richard's gaze flicked toward him, sharp now, focused. "Then you will not mind if we take a closer look," he replied. And the room went quiet again, but this silence was different. This one carried direction, and near the wall Maya lowered her hand slightly, the cloth brushing softly against her side, her part already done, or so it seemed, because no one noticed the way her eyes moved once more to the final page, to a section no one had read yet, where something even smaller, even quieter, waited to be seen. The representative's words hung in the air, smooth but strained, and no one answered him right away because the balance in the room had already shifted, not loudly but definitively, like a door that had quietly closed behind them all, and Richard Hale did not look at him again, not yet. Instead his attention returned to the contract, his fingers sliding it a few inches closer, as if distance itself could no longer be trusted. While across the table the second lawyer leaned forward further, shoulders tightening, eyes scanning faster now, not for reassurance but for damage, and the silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant echo of traffic 30 floors below, until a soft voice came again from the edge of the room. "There is more," Maya said, not raising her tone, not stepping forward, just stating it the way one states something already decided. And this time no one laughed, no one interrupted, because something in the room had learned to listen, and Richard's gaze lifted immediately, locking onto her with a sharper focus than before. "Where?" he asked, and she shifted her eyes slightly toward the final page. "The closing section," she said, "last paragraph." And one of the executives flipped there quickly, almost too quickly, the paper snapping louder than intended, his finger tracing the lines before slowing, then stopping, then tracing again, as if disbelief required confirmation twice. "It references a secondary enforcement clause," he murmured, his voice tightening, and the first lawyer leaned over, reading with him, their shoulders nearly touching now, the quiet space between them filled with the weight of realization. "That clause activates automatically if the primary agreement is disputed," the second lawyer added, and his voice no longer carried authority, only clarity, "which means even if we contest the liability shift, we are still bound to the enforcement penalties." And the room changed. Again, deeper this time, not just concern but recognition, because this was not a mistake, not a simple oversight buried in legal language. This was structure, intentional, layered, designed to hold even when challenged. And across the table the representative's posture stiffened, his calm expression thinning at the edges. "That is an industry standard fallback," he said, but the words landed differently now, hollow in a space that had already begun to see through them, and Richard's hand rested flat against the table, steady but firm, his voice lower now, more controlled than before. Standard does not mean harmless, he said, and the representative did not reply, not immediately, because the room had already moved past him, past explanations, into understanding, and near the wall Maya lowered her gaze briefly, not in retreat, but in completion, as if she had followed the thread to its end and found exactly what she expected, her fingers adjusting the cloth in her hand. A small, quiet motion that contrasted the magnitude of what she had uncovered, and one of the executives leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, the sound soft but heavy. If we had signed this, he said, almost to himself, we would have handed them everything. And no one corrected him, because no one could, and Richard finally pushed the contract away from him. Just an inch, just enough to create space. As if the paper itself carried weight now, and his eyes moved once more to Maya, not with curiosity this time, not even with surprise, but with something steadier, something closer to recognition. And in that moment, the woman who had entered the room unseen had become the one person no one could afford to ignore. While on the far side of the table, the representative's silence spoke louder than any defense he could offer, and the deal that had once seemed certain now stood exposed, not as opportunity, but as something far more dangerous, something that had nearly succeeded. No one reached for the contract anymore, not immediately, as if touching it again might confirm something they were not ready to accept. And the stillness that followed was no longer uncertainty but calculation, the kind that happened behind controlled expressions and quiet breaths, while Richard Hale remained seated, his posture unchanged yet somehow heavier, his hand resting near the edge of the table, fingers still, as his eyes moved once more across the room, not scanning for answers now, but measuring reactions, because in a moment like this, truth did not end the conversation, it redirected it. And across from him, the representative finally shifted in his chair, a small movement, almost polite, but it carried a tension that had not been there before. We can clarify these sections, he said, his voice composed but lacking the earlier ease. Adjust the language to better reflect mutual protection. And for a brief second, it almost sounded reasonable, almost sounded recoverable, until the first lawyer leaned back slowly and exhaled through his nose. The structure is the problem, he replied, his tone quiet but firm. Not the wording. And that distinction settled over the table like a line that could not be crossed back, because wording could be fixed, structure revealed intent, and intent could not be rewritten without consequence. And Richard's gaze shifted toward the representative again, sharper now, more direct. Who drafted this agreement? He asked, and the question did not come with anger. It came with precision, the kind that demanded accuracy, not excuses, and the representative hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough for the room to notice, enough for the silence to tighten again. Our legal team, he answered. And Richard nodded once, slowly, as if filing the response away rather than accepting it, while near the far end of the table one of the executives closed his folder, the soft thud echoing faintly, signaling something unspoken but understood. This was no longer a negotiation. It was an evaluation of risk, and the numbers that once defined opportunity had shifted into something else entirely, something far less predictable. And at the edge of the room Maya remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present, her gaze lowered now, not out of submission but distance, as if she had already stepped outside the weight of what the room was still processing, her hand adjusting the cloth again, a quiet, grounding motion, and Richard noticed it, not the cloth itself but the stillness behind it, the absence of urgency, the way she stood as if she had nothing to gain from what she had said, and that detail lingered longer than the contract ever could, because in rooms like this, everyone usually wanted something, leverage, advantage, recognition, but she had asked for none of it, and that absence carried its own kind of gravity, and he finally pushed his chair back slightly, the soft scrape against the polished floor cutting clean through the silence, drawing every eye back to him. We are not signing this today, he said, his voice calm, final, leaving no room for interpretation, and across the table the representative opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, because there was nothing to negotiate against a decision already made, and the weight of the moment settled fully, not as shock but as realization. Something had been avoided, something significant, something irreversible, And yet the room did not feel relieved. It felt altered, as if the boundaries of who held awareness, who held understanding, had quietly shifted positions, and Richard's eyes moved once more, not to the contract, not to the executives, but back to the woman near the wall. And this time there was no distance in the way he looked at her, only a quiet recognition that the most important voice in the room had come from the place no one had thought to listen. And in that silence, something else began to take shape. Not the deal they had planned, but a different kind of decision, one that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with what came next. No one moved to stand, not even after the decision had been made, because something heavier than the contract now held the room in place, something quieter but far more difficult to ignore. And Richard Hale remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed not on the executives, not on the representative, but on Maya, as if the rest of the room had temporarily lost relevance. And then he did something no one expected. He stood, slowly, deliberately, the movement drawing every eye without a single word, his chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound that echoed just enough to mark the shift. And he stepped away from the table, not toward the exit, not toward the representative, but toward the side of the room, toward her, and the executives exchanged brief glances, uncertain, recalibrating once again, because this was no longer about a deal. It was about something else entirely, something none of them had prepared for. And Maya noticed the movement. Of course she did, but she did not react the way they might have expected. She did not straighten further or shrink back. She simply lifted her eyes to meet his, steady, present, as he stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, close enough that the distance between them no longer carried hierarchy, only awareness. "You read contracts often," he said, not as a question but as an observation, and Maya paused for a fraction of a second, not searching for an answer but choosing the right one. "Not often," she replied quietly, "just when I find them left behind." And a faint ripple moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable, because that answer did not fit the space they were in. It did not align with the expectations they had built around her, and Richard's expression did not change much, but something behind it shifted, something closer to understanding. "And you understood all of that," he said, gesturing slightly toward the table, toward the contract that had nearly been signed, and Maya glanced briefly in that direction before returning her gaze to him. "I understood enough," she said, and there was no pride in her tone, no attempt to claim more than what was true, just clarity, and that clarity carried weight, more than confidence ever could, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable but reflective, as if both were standing at the edge of something neither had anticipated. And then Richard nodded once, slowly, not in dismissal but in acknowledgement. "That was not a small thing," he said, his voice lower now, almost private despite the room still watching, and Maya's fingers adjusted the cloth again, the fabric soft against her palm, grounding, familiar. "It felt like one," she replied, "just a line on paper." And that answer lingered longer than expected, because it reframed everything that had just happened, reduced it to its simplest form while revealing its full impact at the same time. And behind them, one of the executives shifted in his seat, the quiet sound of movement reminding everyone that they were still there, still witnessing something they did not fully understand. And Richard turned slightly, just enough to address the room, without breaking the moment entirely. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said, his tone returning to its usual authority, but carrying something new beneath it, something tempered, with a revised position. And there were nods, quiet ones, immediate, because no one in the room would argue with that now, not after what they had seen, and the representative remained silent, his posture rigid, his earlier confidence replaced with something far less certain. And as the executives began to gather their documents, the sound of folders closing and chairs shifting filling the space again, Richard did not move away. Not yet, his attention returning once more to Maya, as if the rest of the room had already faded. "What is your name?" he asked, and this time it was a question, direct, simple, and Maya answered without hesitation, "Maya Williams." And he repeated it once, quietly, as if committing it to memory rather than acknowledging it aloud. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch just long enough to matter, he said, "Stay," not as a command, not as a request, but as something in between, something open, and Maya did not answer immediately, because for the first time since she had spoken, the moment was no longer about what she saw on paper, it was about what came after, and that, she knew, was never written as clearly. The words stayed in the air longer than expected, not loud, not forceful, just present, and Maya felt it before she decided what it meant, because stay in a room like this did not mean the same thing it would anywhere else. It was not about standing still, it was about stepping into something she had never been invited into before, and for a moment she did nothing, her fingers resting lightly against the folded cloth, her breath steady, her eyes meeting Richard Hale's without hesitation but without agreement either, because she understood something he might not yet see, that crossing a line like this was not just about opportunity, it was about consequence, and around them the room continued to move again, slower now, quieter, executives gathering their folders, chairs sliding back with controlled movements, voices lowered to near whispers as conversations resumed in fragments, but none of it fully returned to normal, because normal had shifted, permanently, and Richard did not repeat himself. He did not press. He simply waited, his posture relaxed but his attention fixed, giving her space that most in his position would not have considered offering, and that space itself carried weight, because it acknowledged her choice, not her position, and Maya finally glanced past him, just briefly, toward the long table where the contract still lay untouched, the pages slightly misaligned now, as if even the paper had lost its certainty, and she took a small step forward, not toward him, but toward the table, her shoes making the softest sound against the polished floor, and when she reached the edge she placed the cloth down beside the document, carefully, deliberately, the gesture simple but clear, separating what she had been doing from what was happening now. And then she looked at the contract again, not as something distant, but as something within reach, and Richard followed her movement without speaking, his gaze shifting from her to the document and back again, as if recalibrating the space between them in real time. "There is a pattern," Maya said quietly, her voice low but steady, and a few of the remaining executives paused, not fully leaving yet, drawn back by the tone more than the words, because it was not urgency that held them, it was certainty, and Richard stepped slightly closer, not crowding, not leading, just aligning himself with the direction of her attention. "What kind of pattern?" he asked, and Maya traced her gaze across the pages without touching them, her eyes moving from one section to another as if following a thread only she could see. "The clauses are layered," she said, "not just to protect, but to redirect responsibility in stages," and the first lawyer, who had been halfway to standing, slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his folder still in his hand, forgotten for the moment. "Explain," he said, and Maya nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "If the first clause does not trigger, the second one does, and if that fails, the enforcement clause activates automatically," she continued, her tone unchanged. "It is not one risk, it is three, built to catch you no matter how you respond." And the room stilled again, not with surprise this time, but with recognition deepening into something more precise, something closer to strategy, and Richard's jaw tightened just enough to show that he was already moving ahead, already thinking beyond what had been revealed into what it meant, and he glanced briefly at the representative, who remained seated, silent, his expression carefully controlled but no longer neutral, and then back to Maya. "And you saw all of that," he said, and she gave the smallest nod. "It is easier when you are not looking for what you expect to see," she replied, and that answer settled differently, because it was not just about the contract anymore. It was about perspective, about who was allowed to see clearly and who had been trained not to question what was placed in front of them. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said had already shifted the ground beneath them, and Richard finally reached for the contract again, not to sign, not even to close it, but to turn it slightly, aligning it with Maya's view instead of his own, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but in that room, it changed everything about who the document now belonged to. The document no longer looked the same, not from where Maya stood, not from where Richard now viewed it either, and the slight turn of the pages toward her created a subtle shift that everyone in the room felt, but no one named, because power had just moved without announcement. And for a moment, no one interrupted. Not the lawyers, not the executives lingering near their chairs, not even the representative across the table whose silence had grown heavier with each passing second, and Maya leaned forward just slightly, not touching the paper, her eyes scanning with a quiet precision that no longer seemed out of place, and Richard watched closely, not as a superior overseeing a subordinate, but as someone trying to follow a line of thought he had not been trained to see. "If you start here," Maya said softly, her voice guiding rather than correcting, "you miss it," and she shifted her gaze toward the earlier pages. "But if you read backward from the enforcement clause, the structure becomes clearer," and the first lawyer adjusted his position again, turning his own copy, flipping to the last page and tracing upward, his brows pulling together as the sequence realigned in his mind. "She is right," he murmured again, quieter this time, almost to himself, and that repetition carried a different weight now, not surprise, but confirmation of a pattern that should have been seen. And Richard's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, not gripping, not tense, just present, as he followed the same path, reading not for assurance but for truth, and the room settled into a new kind of focus, one that did not rely on hierarchy but on clarity. And across the table the representative finally shifted forward, his hands coming together as if to reassert control over a situation that had slipped beyond his reach. "You are interpreting intent where there is none," he said, his tone measured but firm, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see if the balance would tilt back. But Maya did not respond immediately. She did not defend or argue. She simply looked at the page once more, then lifted her eyes toward him, calm, steady. "Then it should be easy to explain why the clauses reinforce each other instead of limiting each other," she said. And the simplicity of the statement cut cleaner than any accusation could have, because it did not challenge his authority, it challenged the structure itself. And the representative's mouth opened slightly, then closed, the answer not arriving as easily as it should have if his claim were true. And that pause spoke louder than anything he could have said, and one of the executives let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under the shift. "We were meant to miss it," he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and no one disagreed. Not even Richard, whose gaze had not left the document, because the realization was no longer theoretical. It was precise, deliberate, undeniable, and he finally straightened, lifting his eyes from the pages and looking directly at Maya again, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with something steadier, something earned. "Most people in this room did miss it," he said, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only acknowledgement, and Maya lowered her gaze briefly, not out of discomfort but humility, her fingers resting lightly against the table now, close enough to the contract that she could feel the cool surface beneath them. And the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was reflective, as if the room itself was adjusting to a new understanding of where insight could come from. And Richard took a slow breath, his shoulders easing just enough to signal a shift from reaction to decision. "We will need a full review of every clause," he said, his voice returning to its measured authority, but carrying a clarity that had not been there before. "Every line." And the lawyers nodded immediately, already reaching for their documents again, their earlier certainty replaced with a sharper, more deliberate focus. And as they began to reorganize the pages, the sound of paper moving filled the room once more, softer now, more careful, as if each word carried more weight than it had just minutes ago. And through it all, Maya remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present in a space that had finally learned to see her. And in that quiet shift, something deeper had changed, not just the outcome of a deal, but the way the room understood who held the ability to protect it. The rhythm of the room had changed completely now, no longer driven by confidence or routine, but by caution, by precision, by the quiet awareness that something fundamental had almost been missed. And as the lawyers began dissecting the document line by line, their voices low, their fingers tracing each sentence with deliberate care, the energy that once filled the space with certainty had been replaced by something sharper, something more honest. And Richard Hale remained standing near the edge of the table, his attention divided between the contract and the woman who had revealed it. as if both now held equal weight in determining what came next, and Maya stood beside the table, not claiming space, not withdrawing from it either, simply existing within it with a calm that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing immediate left to prove, only something deeper to understand. And across the table, the representative finally leaned back, his composure still intact but thinner now, stretched by the realization that control had shifted beyond his reach, and he adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, controlled motion that revealed more than his words had. "We can restructure the agreement," he said again, but this time the sentence felt rehearsed, as if it belonged to a different version of the meeting, one that no longer existed. And no one responded right away, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had already moved past that point, and one of the executives closed his folder more firmly this time. The sound sharper, final. "This is not a matter of restructuring," he said, his voice steady. "This is a matter of intent." And that word settled into the room with quiet force, because intent was not something that could be edited. It was something that had to be faced. And Richard finally stepped back toward the head of the table, his movement slow but deliberate, reclaiming his position not out of dominance, but out of clarity. And as he reached his chair, he did not sit immediately, instead placing one hand lightly against the backrest, grounding himself in the moment. And his eyes moved once more across the room, not searching, not questioning, but aligning everything he had just seen into something actionable. "We suspend all further discussion on this agreement," he said, his voice calm, controlled, leaving no room for negotiation, and the words carried a finality that no one challenged, not even the representative, who now sat in silence, his earlier presence reduced to observation, and the lawyers nodded, already pulling their notes together with renewed urgency, not to close the matter, but to understand it fully, to ensure nothing else had been hidden beneath layers they had once trusted. And through it all, Maya remained still, her gaze resting briefly on the contract before lifting again, not toward the executives, not toward the representative, but toward Richard. And there was something unspoken in that glance, not expectation, not uncertainty, but recognition of the moment for what it was, a turning point that had not been planned. And Richard met her gaze without hesitation, his expression steady, and for the first time, there was no distance left between how he saw her and what she had done. And he gave the smallest nod, not a gesture of authority, but of acknowledgement, quiet, genuine. And in that simple movement, something else shifted, something beyond the contract, beyond the meeting, something that suggested the real change had not happened on paper at all, but in the space between who had been ignored and who was now being seen. The room did not empty all at once. It thinned slowly, like tension releasing in layers, one quiet movement at a time, chairs sliding back, folders closing, low voices exchanging fragments of what had just happened without fully naming it. And yet no one rushed, because something in the air held them just a moment longer than necessary, something unresolved, something still forming. And Richard Hale finally took his seat again, not out of habit but intention, his posture composed, his hands resting lightly on the table as he watched the last of the executives gather their materials, his gaze occasionally shifting toward the contract that still lay open, its pages now marked, no longer pristine, no longer trusted. And across the table the representative stood as well, smoothing the front of his jacket, his expression carefully neutral, but the pause before he spoke revealed more than his words would. "We will await your revisions," he said, measured, controlled, as if trying to restore a sense of order to a conversation that had already moved beyond him. And Richard gave a brief nod, nothing more, not an agreement, not an acknowledgement of equal footing, just closure. And with that, the representative turned and walked toward the door, his steps steady but slightly quicker than before. And when the door closed behind him, the soft click echoed through the room with a finality that no one could ignore. And for a moment, silence returned again, but this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if the room itself was processing what it had almost allowed to happen. And one of the lawyers exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "We missed it," he said quietly, not to defend himself, not to assign blame, just to state the truth as it now existed, and no one corrected him. Because there was nothing to correct, and Richard's eyes remained on the table for a moment longer before lifting again, not to the lawyers, not to the empty chairs, but to Maya, who still stood near the edge of the table, her presence unchanged, her posture calm, as if the weight of the moment had not settled on her in the same way it had on everyone else. And that difference mattered, because it revealed something none of them had considered before, that clarity did not always come from pressure. Sometimes it came from distance, from seeing what others overlooked because they were too close to it. And Richard leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing just enough to signal that the immediate crisis had passed. But his focus did not shift away. "You said you read what is left behind," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured, and Maya gave a small nod, her eyes meeting his again. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to reshape the truth into something more acceptable. And Richard studied her for a moment, not with skepticism, not with doubt, but with a kind of attention that suggested he was rethinking something far larger than the contract itself. "Why?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it was not about the document. It was about her, about the reason behind the clarity she carried into a room that had not been built for her. And Maya paused, just briefly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath them, grounding herself in something real before answering. "Because no one else does," she said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet force, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. And one of the executives looked down at the contract again, as if seeing it differently now, not just as a document, but as something that had been assumed, overlooked, trusted without question. And Richard's gaze did not waver, because in that answer was something he understood immediately, something he had not expected to find. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of recognition, of realization, of a shift that had nothing to do with legal language and everything to do with how easily truth could be ignored when it came from the wrong place. And in that moment, the meeting was no longer about what had almost been lost, but about what had just been found. The words lingered longer than anything else that had been said in the room, not because they were loud, but because they were simple, and simplicity had a way of cutting through layers that complexity often hid behind. And Richard Hale did not look away, not after hearing them, not after realizing how much had nearly been overlooked because no one thought to look twice. And for a moment, he said nothing, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze steady on Maya as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about where insight came from. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, a pause that allowed the weight of her answer to settle fully. And then he shifted slightly in his chair, leaning forward just enough to signal that the moment was not over, that something else needed to be addressed. "And if you had not said anything," he asked, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a depth that had not been there before, "would you have just walked out?" And the question hung between them, not accusatory, not skeptical, but real, because it was no longer about the contract. It was about choice, about what she had decided to do in a room that had never asked her to speak. And Maya glanced down briefly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table, grounding herself again before answering. "Yes," she said quietly. And the honesty in that single word shifted something again, subtle but undeniable, because it revealed that what she had done had not been driven by expectation or reward. It had been a decision made in a moment where no one was watching her, no one was asking her. And that mattered. And Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly as he absorbed it, because in his world, decisions were often tied to outcomes, to leverage, to gain. But this had been different. This had been a choice made without any of that. And across the room, one of the lawyers closed his folder more gently this time, the earlier tension replaced with something quieter, something more reflective, as if the room itself had begun to understand the difference between knowledge and integrity. And Richard's gaze returned to Maya again, more focused now, more certain. "You understood what that clause could do," he said, not as a question, but as a continuation of something larger. And Maya nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she replied. And he held her gaze for a moment longer before asking the question. That followed naturally. "Then why speak up?" And this time, the room felt it. the shift in the question, because it reached beyond the contract, beyond the meeting, into something more personal, something more fundamental, and Maya did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, steady, unchanged, because it would not have been right to stay quiet, she said. And the simplicity of it landed with more force than any detailed explanation could have, because it did not rely on complexity. It did not justify itself. It simply existed as truth. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing else needed to be added, and Richard leaned back fully now, his posture easing in a way that signaled not relaxation, but resolution, as if something within him had aligned with what he had just heard. And he nodded once, slowly, not as acknowledgement of her answer, but as acceptance of it. And the room remained quiet, not tense, not uncertain, but changed, as if the definition of value had just been rewritten without anyone realizing it until now. And in that stillness, the contract on the table no longer held the same weight, because the most important decision of the day had not been about signing or not signing. It had been about whether someone chose to speak when they did not have to, and that choice had just altered everything. The silence did not break immediately after her words. It settled deeper, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to a truth that did not come from strategy or negotiation, but from something far simpler. And Richard Hale remained still, his gaze steady on Maya, not searching for more, not questioning, just holding the moment in place long enough for it to fully exist. And then he shifted slightly, his hand moving away from the edge of the table as he leaned forward again, not out of urgency, but intention. Most people in this room would have stayed quiet, he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying something quieter beneath it, something closer to reflection than authority. And Maya did not respond right away, not because she disagreed, but because she understood that he was not asking for confirmation. He was acknowledging something he had just realized. And across the room, one of the executives lowered himself back into his chair, the movement slow, thoughtful, as if he too was reconsidering the choices he might have made in that same moment. And Richard continued, his eyes not leaving hers. They would have assumed it was not their place, he added. And that word lingered, place, because it defined everything that had just been challenged, everything that had just shifted without announcement. And Maya's fingers rested lightly against the table, the surface cool beneath her skin, grounding her as she answered. Maybe, she said quietly, and her voice carried no judgment, no criticism, just possibility. And that made the difference, because she was not standing above anyone in the room. She was simply standing within it, and that alone had changed the balance. And Richard nodded once, slowly, as if the answer aligned with something he had already begun to understand. And he glanced briefly at the contract, still open, still marked, but no longer central, no longer the focus of the room, and then back at her. You did not assume that, he said. And again, it was not a question, it was recognition, and Maya's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged. No, she replied, and the simplicity of it carried the same weight as before, because it did not need explanation, it did not need defense. It simply existed as fact, and for a moment, the room seemed to settle into that understanding, not just of what had happened, but of why it had happened. And one of the lawyers leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together now, his earlier certainty replaced with something more careful, more aware. We rely on process, he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. But process only works when someone questions it. And no one disagreed, because they had just seen what happened when no one did. And Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back once more, his posture easing but his focus remaining sharp, because the moment was no longer about reacting. It was about deciding what to do with what had been revealed. And his gaze shifted again, not just to Maya, but to the room, to the people who had built their roles around systems that had almost failed them, and then back to her. You changed the outcome of this meeting, he said, his voice steady, clear, not exaggerated, not softened, just true. And the words carried a different kind of weight, because they were not praise, they were acknowledgement of impact. And Maya lowered her gaze slightly for a moment, not out of discomfort, but reflection, as if the scale of what had happened was only now beginning to settle into something real. And when she looked back up, her expression remained calm. Grounded. "I just said what I saw," she replied, and that answer, once again, shifted the meaning of everything, because it reduced something extraordinary into something simple, something human, something accessible. And the room held that thought for a moment longer, because it revealed a truth they could not ignore, that the difference between what almost happened and what did happen had come down to one person choosing to speak, and in that choice, everything else had followed. The room did not rush to fill the silence this time. It held it, as if everyone present understood that something more important than the contract had just been revealed, something that could not be written into clauses or negotiated across a table. And Richard Hale remained seated, his posture composed, but his expression no longer distant, no longer guarded in the way it had been at the start of the meeting. And his eyes rested on Maya with a steadiness that suggested he was no longer evaluating her, but considering what her presence meant beyond this moment. And slowly, deliberately, he reached forward and closed the contract, not abruptly, not with finality, but with care, aligning the pages as if restoring order to something that had nearly unraveled. And the soft sound of paper meeting paper echoed quietly, signaling an end not just to the discussion, but to the version of events that had almost taken place. And one of the executives shifted in his seat, watching the gesture closely, understanding that the decision had already been made, not just about the deal, but about what would follow. And Richard's voice came again, calm, controlled, but carrying a different weight now, something more intentional. "We will rebuild this from the ground up," he said, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, to the process they had trusted without question. And the lawyers nodded immediately, their earlier certainty replaced with a sharper awareness, already thinking ahead, already adjusting. And yet none of them spoke further, because their focus had moved beyond discussion into action. And Richard's attention returned to Maya, not briefly, not in passing, but fully. And for a moment he said nothing, allowing the space between them to exist without pressure, without expectation. And then he stood again, not out of authority, but purpose, stepping away from the head of the table and moving closer to where she stood, closing the distance that had once defined their roles. And when he stopped, it was not as someone addressing an employee, but as someone recognizing a person who had changed the outcome of something significant. "You saw what all of us missed," he said, his voice quiet, direct, not exaggerated, not softened, just true. And Maya did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she understood that what he was saying was not about the contract anymore. It was about perspective, about how easily something critical could be overlooked when everyone assumed it had already been handled. And she glanced briefly at the closed document before looking back at him, her expression calm, grounded. "I saw what was there," she said, and again. Her words simplified something that had carried enormous weight, reducing it to clarity, to presence, to attention. And Richard nodded slowly, as if that answer aligned with something he had only just begun to understand. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to prove, only something left to decide. And the room remained still, the executives now observers rather than participants, watching a moment unfold that none of them had anticipated. And Richard finally spoke again, his tone unchanged, but his words carrying a different kind of intention. "We need people who see what is there," he said, and the statement did not sound like an offer, not yet, but it carried the shape of one, something forming just beneath the surface. And Maya's fingers rested lightly at her side, no longer holding the cloth, no longer anchored to the role she had entered the room with. And she did not step forward, she did not step back. She simply stood where she was, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because the space between them was no longer defined by position or expectation, but by recognition. And in that recognition, the next decision had already begun to take shape. The room had grown quieter than it had been at any point before, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been revealed. And Richard Hale stood just a few feet from Maya, the distance between them no longer defined by roles or expectations, but by something far simpler, something far more difficult to ignore, and for a moment he did not speak. He simply looked at her, not assessing, not calculating, just seeing, as if the clarity she carried had forced him to reconsider more than just a contract. And behind them the executives remained still, their presence now secondary, witnesses to a moment that no longer belonged to them. And the city outside the glass walls continued as it always had, unaware that inside this room something had shifted in a way numbers could never measure. And Richard finally took a slow breath, his shoulders easing, not from relief, but from decision. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, but quieter than before, as if the weight of what he was about to say did not require volume. "You were not hired to be in this room," he said, and the statement could have carried judgment once, but now it held something else, something closer to truth without blame. And Maya did not react, not defensively, not uncertainly. She simply held his gaze, allowing the words to exist without interruption, and he continued, "But you were the only one who saw what mattered." And the shift between those two sentences settled into the space between them, redefining everything that had come before. And Maya's fingers rested lightly at her side, no longer gripping anything, no longer anchored to the role she had walked in with. And for a moment she said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that this moment was not about proving anything further. And Richard nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her. And then he stepped back, just slightly, not creating distance, but giving space, the kind of space that allowed a choice to exist without pressure. And he glanced briefly at the closed contract on the table, then back at her. "We are going to rebuild this deal," he said, his tone returning to its measured clarity, line by line. And there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, only direction, and the executives behind him shifted subtly, already understanding what that would mean, already adjusting to a process that would not allow the same oversight again. And then Richard's gaze returned fully to Maya, and this time there was no hesitation at all. "If you are willing," he said, and the words came, without formality, without distance, "I want you in that room when we do." And the offer did not sound like an offer in the traditional sense. It did not carry the weight of authority or obligation. It carried recognition, and that made it different. And the room held its breath again, not out of tension, but anticipation, because this was not about a contract anymore. It was about what came after. And Maya stood still for a moment, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and then she glanced once more at the table, at the document that had nearly defined everything, before looking back at him. And when she spoke, her voice remained the same as it had been from the beginning, calm, grounded, unchanged by the shift around her. "I do not need to be in the room," she said quietly, and the words landed softly, but they carried weight, because they did not reject the offer, they redefined it. And Richard's expression did not harden, did not shift into confusion. He simply listened, and she continued, "You just need to make sure the right people are willing to see." And the simplicity of it settled into the space between them, clear, direct, leaving nothing hidden behind it. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the truth of it did not require response. And Richard nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding. And he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, across the people who had built their certainty on systems that had nearly failed them, and then back to her. And there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, something steadier, as if the lesson had already taken hold. And Maya stepped back then, just one step, not retreating, not leaving, but returning to herself, to the place she had come from, and the space she left behind did not close. It remained, altered, changed, and Richard reached for the contract once more, not to sign it, not to review it, but to move it aside completely, clearing the table. And the gesture was simple, almost unnoticed, but it carried meaning, because the most important decision of the day had already been made, and it had nothing to do with the paper in front of them. And as the room slowly began to move again, quieter, more deliberate than before, the reflection of the city lights across the glass table shifted with it, softer now, less sharp, and in that reflection, for just a moment, there was no difference between where she stood and where he did, only two people in the same light, understanding something that could not be written, but would not be forgotten.